Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Audience, wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to philosophy and science, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we are joined by Mr. Stephen Feldstein, speaking about repression in the digital age. Stephen Feldstein is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program. His research focuses on technology and politics, U.S. foreign policy, international relations, and the global context for democracy and human rights. Mr. Feldstein is the author of The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance, which was the recipient of the 2023 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Stephen was a distinguished public servant who served in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee along the likes of Joe Biden and John Kerry. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, he oversaw critical areas like Africa, international labor affairs, and religious freedom. With a strong educational background and a commitment to global development, he continues to make a significant impact on the international stage at the Carnegie Endowment. We are honored to have him as our guest. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Stephen, thank you for joining us on The Focus.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
To kick things off, let's talk about the use of artificial intelligence in authoritarian regimes. In a recent article, you discussed how autocratic governments have increasingly turned to AI technologies to suppress their populations. Could you provide some insight into how they've been utilizing AI for this purpose?
So, I think with artificial intelligence, what we're seeing is reflective of a broader dynamic, which is that people are increasingly online. Computers, networks, smartphones are such a central component to how people live and work and communicate and shop, that it's a natural place also for authoritarian governments to then say, well, what more can we glean from this? What behavioral patterns can we find out? And more importantly, what can we learn in terms of the private communications and the ways that different individuals are organizing potentially to challenge the government? And so, when you think of this kind of social control aspect, one of the pioneers and cutting edge proponents of this has been the government in China, has been the Chinese Communist Party. And, they've really kind of pushed this idea of social control for a long time. What we've started to see in the past 6 to 10 years has been a real investment in advanced technologies, and in particular, an investment in trying to harness and integrate as much data as available in order to access and find out more about individuals in society and everything they might be doing. And so we've seen kind of with China, whether it's with regard to smart cities that have been established in the mainland, or whether it's with regard to Xinjiang, a greater reliance on these automatic artificial intelligence powered surveillance and censorship tools. And I think what's interesting is that, that is a model that is being adopted to different degrees in by different countries around the world. So it's far from being just an exclusively Chinese tool and method of social control. We're more and more seeing these advanced tools being used by a variety of different regimes in many regions around the world. So that's kind of an opening. That's an opening.
Great opening. But how has the unchecked collection of personal data disrupted traditional notions of privacy, and what impact has it had on individual freedoms in the digital age? I mean, what are the obvious differences between how autocracies and democracies handle this? After all, most autocracies today are not against capitalism, so they're not ideologically separated from us, as was the case during the Cold War. As a matter of fact, you raised a really interesting point just a moment ago, and that is that, looking at the People's Republic of China, it's a trading nation. Our deep interdependencies in terms of technology with regard to trade have allowed them almost unlimited penetration of all of our systems. So we're living in a very peculiar time, aren't we?
Yeah, no, we are, and I think you raised a couple interesting points. I mean, let's start with the idea of privacy. I think there's sort of two ways to square privacy, or think about how privacy has been transformed. So traditionally, let's say in kind of pre-digital times, I think there were much clearer bounds when it came to what was acceptable and what was private and what was public. And so if you look at the United States and the kind of constitutional protections, if you're in the four walls of your own home, the idea that a police officer could go in without a warrant and take a look at what you've been doing, find some kind of illegal activity, and then use that to charge you was something that was prohibited constitutionally, right? But whether you're in a democracy or whether you're in an autocracy, those standards are far reduced when it comes to the digital age. So the idea that you either have bulk collection by intelligence of electronic communications and data, or that police officers, for example, are now able to look at social media feeds and sort of glean information from that, and then use that to charge individuals for crimes, whether it's the insurrection that occurred, in Washington D.C., or other types of violations. There's now a blurring of the lines. Now, someone might argue, well, social media is the public square, and so therefore it's similar to finding someone doing something illegal in a public part of a city and therefore charging them. But I think I don't think that's quite right. And so part of our problem is definitional. Like, what is social media? What is private and what is not? If you're in a big WhatsApp group of 100 people, right, is that private or is that public? And to what extent does law enforcement in a democracy have the right to take information from that and use that to charge a crime? There are no answers to that. And partially, at least in the United States, that's because we don't have any privacy legislation. So that's part of the problem, is just that we have a lot of ambiguity when it comes to understanding and defining notions of privacy. Now step back for a second and let's look at authoritarian regimes. The same idea of protection of privacy has never been commensurate to what you've seen in liberal democracies, and that's by design. You look at countries like East Germany, in the Cold War, Ethiopia, more recently, certainly China. The idea that one has a right to keep the state at bay, to not allow physical agents to look through things and then use that the collected material as a way to charge crimes, simply isn't true. And so in a sense, in authoritarian regimes, when you see the extension of these tools, surveillance tools and so forth, into the digital realm, there's a lot more continuity. It makes a lot more sense. It falls in line with past practices that you see in authoritarian regimes anyway when it comes to social control. Where it's a little bit different and where you get into a stickier situation, I think, is in democracies where there were clear lines and distinctions between what is private and what isn't, but where in the digital age right now, those lines have not been delineated. Certainly not in the United States, maybe a little more in Europe, but still, I think a lot of it's fairly nascent.
Digital authoritarianism and repression aren't just about the usual suspects: Russia, China, various Middle Eastern and African autocracies. We in the West, as we've just pointed out, have plenty of room for being digitally repressed too, opening our societies to fostering autocratic tendencies. Could you elaborate on the ways in which disinformation and propaganda disseminated online have poisoned the public sphere and influenced electoral outcomes, as exemplified by the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the Russian interference in the 2016 US elections?
Yeah, sure. And let me just start from the premise that you laid out, which is that when it comes to sort of these digital repression techniques, they're not limited just to closed authoritarian states. It's not just a China-Russia problem; it extends far more widely. And I think is also interesting is that when I think of democracies, I really sort of think of two tiers of democracies. I think of the kind of most highly protected liberal democracies, the United States, countries in Europe, Australia, Japan, and so forth, Korea. And then I think of sort of a second sort of slightly lower tier of countries where you have both illiberal aspects and liberal attributes. So, for example, India is a good case in point. Turkey, Nigeria, where you have elections that occur on a regular basis, but you also have an information environment that's rigged towards one party, where you have rampant misinformation, disinformation that affects electoral outcomes, and where you see democratic backsliding taking place. And so, just to kind of note that even within democracies, there's not uniformity. There's kind of stronger and weaker democracies. Now, amongst the stronger democracies, as you mentioned, there has been a lot of disinformation that has flowed through and affected elections and so forth. I think there's still a debate amongst researchers to what extent these disinformation efforts have had specific and profound electoral effects, or to what extent have they contributed noise, confuse the issue, but ultimately haven't led to that much of a switching. And we can continue. We could debate this for the next year and not come up with any real conclusion. But what we can say is that we have an information environment, one of which a lot of people are now involved in, participate in, where there is lots of falsehoods that are spread. And we also know that, especially when it comes to the conservative ecosystem in many countries, the United States in particular, there are lots of conspiracy theories that permeate, falsehoods, and so forth, and that those have real world effects in terms of allowing certain types of populist politicians to have followings that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have if not for social media. And so I think what we've really seen is that many of the safeguards and rules, the gatekeeping functions that in the past different public outlets or even private outlets played when it came to television, radio, newspapers, and so forth, they've really fallen by the wayside. And that even today, more than a couple of years ago, when you look at some of the bigger platforms, particularly Twitter, or the former Twitter, I mean, you see those guardrails completely being pushed aside. And so, it does raise the question, well, what is, where are we with social media, and where is it going? And to what extent, or what is our tolerance level in democracies when it comes to further poisoning of the information landscape? And I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly worries me for upcoming elections. And, when it comes to just thinking about trends of information integrity, I see a real battle ahead.
Is the reluctance of imposing government regulations on tech companies specializing in AI due to its profound impacts on issues such as governance and war? I mean, do the companies that are and the governments who are sort of pushing their particular AI agenda aware of the power that they're dealing with? And if so, this really speaks to a very dark and perhaps even conspiratorial note. I mean, if autocracies use AI as repressive agents, then we among the democratic states need to mirror them in at least insofar as that we don't fall behind what we can say is a race to the bottom. And this really doesn't bode well for humanity and our stewardship of this new technology, right?
Yeah, and I hope we're not going to enter in a race to the bottom. I don't think anyone wins in that situation. And I think, democracies, it's really incumbent upon democracies to kind of hold firm and not give in to those, those tendencies. So I don't want to kind of go in that direction yet. I mean, what I would say, there are a couple kind of big issues. I think one, there is a difference between the lack of an ability, especially in the United States, to come up with regulations when it comes to social media versus what I feel like is a better or more optimistic possibility when it comes to regulating AI companies like OpenAI and others that are leading the charge on generative AI. So I would put those in two buckets. And I would say in the former bucket, when it comes to social media companies, part of the reason why regulation is so difficult, not impossible, is because it's been politicized, because there's a viewpoint among different communities that regulation will favor one community over another. And that's why you have this kind of conservative liberal dynamic at play, where conservatives say it's going to be biased, it's going to stop our voices, and liberals say we can't have another insurrection, and neither side is willing to give in. And so therefore, finding the political will to break the logjam is impossible. But I think with generative AI, I think the arguments are slightly different. I think with generative AI, what you see with companies is, especially with the largest market players, Google and OpenAI and Meta and a few others, is that they have a market advantage right now. They are the kind of market leaders. They are the first movers, and they have an incentive to call for a certain type of administrative regulation that will help them cement their leadership and will crowd out smaller players from competing with them when it comes to large language models and what they do. And so part of that is really an economic issue, right? It's an issue of to what extent will a sort of nascent monopoly or oligopoly of a few large, tech companies be able to sort of maintain and consolidate their control of the sector versus a type of regulatory approach that would really open up to a much farther degree a playing field where smaller players could compete as well. And, if you were to ask me right now, I think the big players are winning.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think the big players are winning, and it's kind of weird because it also speaks to a trend in the West where we have large companies forming monopolies, or you have large companies having almost a conspiratorial bond between them, not to step on each other's feet. It's like, where does the real competition come in? Because if competition is all meant to be about a system that's loose and whatever succeeds in the marketplace, whatever fails. Here we go by this new methodology, which has really only been with us for the last 20 odd years, the too big to fail methodology. Well, what happens to the world of the internet if, for instance, Google falls over or Apple gets broken up by some antitrust law that we don't know about? These are things that obviously need to be addressed at some point. Maybe the Europeans are doing a better job of this kind of thing. I don't know. I mean, I know that they pushed through some much stricter kind of regulations, and there is a sort of transatlantic divide in terms of how the Europeans and the Americans are viewing all of this. Can you speak to our audience with regard to what your thoughts are on all of this?
Yeah, no, I think you raise a number of really important issues and complicated issues. One of the books actually I would point to, that was written by a colleague of mine, a non-resident at Carnegie and a professor at Columbia, Anna Bradford. It's a book called Digital Empire. She would be a great guest for you for a future
thank you.
a future episode.
Okay.
And her book just came out in September. And she's the one who originally coined the term Brussels effect, the idea that even if Europe doesn't have the innovative companies based in the region, its regulatory effect is enough to push forward its own values and preferences to be adopted around the rest of the world. So she wrote that book and that idea about 10 or 15 years ago, and now she's followed up with kind of the exact issue that you're alluding to, which is that increasingly she views the world as being divided into sort of three areas of influence. So you have Europe and this sort of regulatory state, America with much more of a laissez-faire neoliberal construction, and then you're sort of authoritarian China, Russia to some degree, being in this kind of third component, each of them developing different rules, norms, modes of practice, and economic logics to how their companies operate. And so, I think where that leads us is that with Europe, you are seeing a pretty aggressive, assertive regulatory push. You have the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, which come into effect at the end of the year. Those will actually have, I think, some influence in reshaping Amazon, Google, and others when it comes to their search. Now, to what extent will that translate over to the rest of the world? I don't really know. But I think we're already seeing some murmurings that some of the models that have been used when it comes to accessing user data and then reapplying that towards selling ads and so forth need to be rethought. And then, of course, Europe also has an AI Act that isn't quite passed, but is very close to passage, hopefully by end of the year. Again, will that translate over outside the bloc? I don't know, but I think it will have some kind of persuasive effect as well. So what we're seeing, and to some extent, is especially amongst Europe and the United States, while the U.S. dithers, and while there's a vacuum of regulation, and while there's a growing gap between innovation and serving the public interest, Europe has stepped in to some degree. And so I think that is one way that we're starting to see some of the changes that are needed. But I think overall, we have a problem of network effect in that the power you get and the economic efficiency you get from having a mass of people gathered together on one platform, whether it's for information purposes, being able to access all your friends within one network on one platform, or whether it's for e-commerce purposes, that if you have, the more sellers you have, the more you have competition centered in one place, the easier it is for a consumer to then get the best price. Those also lead over time into monopolistic situations. And eventually, I think what it does is, at least the economic inefficiencies, it allows one platform to capture an audience and there's a temptation for that platform to undercut choice and to control what that market looks like. And I think that leads to perverted outcomes. So that's your problem, is that the network effect both helps things in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's a corrosive trend that undermines economic competition and undermines a free exchange of ideas.
Now, Stephen, just a little bit on the sort of outside of things, if you don't mind. Noted Israeli writer and public intellectual Yuval Noah Harari argues that we humans need to exercise control over AI to keep it in the realm of a useful yet relatively harmless tool. However, this doesn't seem likely since, on the one hand, autocracies see AI as their ultimate defense for regime survival, while capitalist democracies see it as a bottomless money-making enterprise, with the added perk of redistributing social and political power to corporations, allowing them to regulate how their consumers behave, especially their spending habits. If intense competition is a prerequisite for successful evolution, how long do you think it will take for this particular intense competition to drive AI sentience? And will we ever know when this threshold is crossed?
Yeah, boy, you're getting into like the deep questions. And you're right. There is a real debate taking place on the sort of along the lines of AI safety, about whether existentially we're getting to a point where general AI is something that will permeate super intelligence and allow for machines to really kind of gather new modes of control and access to information, even possibly replacing sort of human choice. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't. I mean, what I can say now is that there's lots of speculation out there. There is a lot of concern. A lot of it is not grounded by the evidence that we see. In the paper that you mentioned, I published a recent paper just earlier this week in Survival Journal on generative AI's consequences for war and democracy. I specifically focused the paper on sort of the more sort of immediate and medium-term effects. So as we look ahead in war, to what extent will machine learning algorithms affect decision-making on the battlefield? When we look in democracy and we see the centralization of information by private actors, what effect will that have on democratic deliberation? Because these are things that are sort of linked to measurable and concrete outcomes that I understand and I know. But then, but there is a separate set of questions which I didn't explore in the article, which sort of says, well, what happens beyond? And I think we have to take that seriously. I don't know that I'm the right person to really kind of extrapolate or speculate. I'm not sure there's many futurists out there who can say with a ton of certainty that we know the pathway that we're going on, and it's one that's where there's a lot of peril, and that only if we do these 3 or 4 things can we sort of remove these dangers from occurring. So I think it's one that needs a lot more study and thinking, and one where policymakers need to be attuned to the risks. But I also think it's important not to jump ahead of where we are either, to take a sobered approach to it, because I don't think that it's to anyone's benefit just to come up with a host of regulations that are ill-informed, that are not future-proof, that actually get at the wrong types of risks, and you end up leading to unintended outcomes. I mean, that's something that we see all the time in regulations, where you think you're solving one problem and you actually end up opening a Pandora's box for a host of others. So I think we just have to sort of iterate and look as we see, be attuned to how innovation is moving, and be responsive. And unfortunately, I think this is where the biggest challenge lies, that we don't necessarily have the right kind of regulatory design right now in most countries, or certainly globally, that allows for that kind of flexibility of iteration, that allows to view and see risks and threats as they emerge and to react accordingly. Instead, we have a very antiquated and very fragmented mode of governance right now. And I think that is a first step that governments can all take that would start to rectify this problem, so that we are future-proofed as a society for the risks that will be forthcoming in the coming years.
Actually, talking about your article in Survival, which was a very good piece, and we'll have a link in our show notes for our listeners. Can you
Thank
say
you.
that bureaucratic inertia is our only real hope for slowing AI technical developments down? Democracies and autocracies have an innate habit of holding on to outdated systems, even when faced by far superior technologies on the market. Therefore, there will always be those countries that pick them up faster than others, leading to a world of glaring AI asymmetries. Bureaucratic inertia is particularly encouraged in autocracies because their entire rationale is not to adopt things that state authorities do not fully understand or could be the means for covert subversion.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something. I think that's exactly right. And that was one of the themes I try to hit upon in my book, The Rise of Digital Repression, which is that
Hmm.
you may have tools out there that can collect data in bulk, that can be used and kind of meshed with biometric surveillance and so forth, that if used to their full capacity, could have really chilling effects in terms of how societies operate. But you do come against the human problem, which is that humans are faulty operators when it comes to
Hmm.
implementing these systems.
Yep.
That bureaucracies stand in the way of integrating them. I mean, look, I'll give you an example. Look at China. Many people have talked about its designs and kind of the social credit system, which is supposed to be this way to assign a score to every citizen in China, in the country, on a host of political and social measures, and then basically say if you said critical things about the government, your score goes down. You can't access a loan. You said you jaywalk, your score goes down. You can't get a discount, for this or that benefit. And so in theory, it sounds very Orwellian. It sounds like a perfect tool of social control. In practice, the databases and information and on which to access this stuff remains very segmented. They're controlled by different departments. The social credit system, maybe works for getting loans tied to financial information because that ends up being in one siloed data system. But when it comes to other information that would feed in, data fusion is still something that's very far away, and that's in probably the governance leader when it comes to using this. So look at other countries where, I mean, many countries are still like, look at India. I mean, on the one hand, you have biometric surveillance and facial recognition in cities. On the other hand, you still have this last mile problem when it comes to connectivity. And so the obstacles developmentally are very real. And I actually take it actually gives me a little bit of hope in that regard, in that I think the bureaucratic systems are not going to leap forward at the same pace that the innovation will.
Yeah.
I think where there's problems, I think where we need to kind of watch out is in the privatized market. I think where there's less bureaucratic encumbrances when it comes to platforms and AI companies and so forth, rolling out different products that have the potential for mass disruption. So even looking at what ChatGPT-3 has done so far, and that's just, that's already a couple, large language models back from what this state of the art is. The global effects of that are very real and are very significant. And it's not the government leading on that, it's private companies.
Stephen, has the Biden administration's chip war against China done anything to curb this autocracy's capacity for digital repression? I mean, surely to pursue ever more inventive digital repression, having open access to advanced semiconductors must be a prerequisite.
Yeah, it is to some extent. And I certainly think I give credit to the Biden administration for doing quite a bit. I mean, I honestly see the chip war side when it comes to denying it, the most advanced AI chips, to China to be more of a geopolitical, having a geopolitical logic to it, as opposed to a countering authoritarianism logic. And that I think it's about preserving competitive advantages when it comes to economies and when it comes to military innovation. It's not so much about trying to protect democracy, because I think it's a much more complicated question when it comes to democracy. So I think in that end, there's been a limited effect. What I will say though also is that you don't necessarily need the very latest chips in order to do a lot of damage when it comes to digital repression. With sort of many dual use mid-tier items, you need microprocessors, you need microchips that can power smartphones and so forth, and allow for different data management platforms to operate. But frankly speaking, you don't need the very advanced chips on the market to be able to do a lot of things that can be damaging. And the other thing I would say too is that despite, even if the Biden administration were to be able to flip a switch and all of a sudden deny access to all the advanced AI chips in the world, or at least try to do so, in reality, that would be impossible because there's such a leakage. There's so many clandestine networks that kind of move technology around. I mean, a good example is what's happening with Russia. I mean, there certainly has been a real geopolitical motivation for Western countries to deny Russia the chips that are used to power precision missiles and drones and so forth. So what has Russia done? Well, it's created clandestine transshipment networks to Hong Kong. It's worked with other, kind of third parties based in Turkey, based in Iran, and other countries to procure the technology needed to power its war machine. So even when it comes to life and death, even when it comes to sort of military issues, the strategy of denial of technology is very leaky. So when it comes to then the kind of China chip war question, at least when it comes as it relates to digital authoritarianism, it's not gonna have that much of an effect at the end of the day.
It's clear that AI technology has become a very powerful tool for autocrats, but why are they investing so heavily in these technologies when traditional means of repression have worked so well in the past? Is there a demographic imperative? China and Russia are known to have rapidly aging societies. Perhaps they don't have enough young people to intimidate, manhandle, and arrest dissenters like they used to.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and there's a lot of sort of theories out there. I think there's a couple. I think there's a couple explanations. So I think one explanation is that you go where the challenge is, right? You go where the risk factors lie, and if we are becoming increasingly digital societies, then using digital tools makes sense. Like, how are we going to use physical agents to really get a handle on what people are saying or thinking if they're communicating strictly by signal on WhatsApp or Telegram, right? So you need to kind of figure out new tools to kind of keep pace with where society is. I mean, a second thing is that in the long term, using digital surveillance tools and so forth can be a lot cheaper. It can be a lot more efficient. So rather than rely on human operators to kind of laboriously collect information, to go house to house, to have like a 5-to-1 or a 9-to-1 system of one surveilling, person for every 5 or 9 people in the neighborhood, you can rely on automated agents. They collect information constantly. They're able to kind of probe and look at different places that are otherwise inaccessible to human beings, and it helps to kind of power the system. Now, that's not to say that you don't need to have people on the ground. And so whether you're looking at Xinjiang in China, or you're looking at the actual physical incarceration of anti-war protesters in the Moscow metro, I mean, oftentimes the best sort of approaches are ones that are hybrid, where you have a, kind of a frontline system of technology that sort of flags individuals of interest, and you then follow them up with security forces that pick up people for questioning, imprison individuals who are dissenters, give large jail times backed up by anti-democratic laws, and then throw them in prison. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, if you look at Russia, what are the symbols of resistance that we see, and what is their effort? What is their impact, or what is the effect that they're feeling? Well, look at Alexei Navalny in the Gulag. He's in. Yeah, that's not very digital. It's very physical.
Yeah.
He's stuck in the middle of somewhere, locked in essentially in isolation, deprived of food, deprived of contact on the outside. Nothing digital about that. And so those types of methods exist and are predominant. Look at the prisons in Iran and the type of conditions that those protesting the regime have found themselves in. Look at the same type of prisons that you can find in places like North Korea and China. And there's a lot of similarity, even though we are in sort of a digital age, even though digital authoritarianism is a thing that we think a lot about. The physical coercion side of things is very real, and it persists.
We did a podcast recently on North Korea, and you just mentioned North Korea in passing. For many outsiders looking at North Korea, they have a hard time thinking that North Korea has got a very good or even competently run cyber infrastructure. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that country actually does have in order for it to keep repressing its own people, keeping it on its side of the 38th parallel?
I'm not an expert in North Korea, so I don't want to go out too far on a limb when it comes to what they're doing, but I will just say a couple sort of basic things. So I think one, there's with North Korea, there's such a high degree of coercion that it almost becomes self-perpetuating in terms of the fear and the ability to control people along those lines. We also know that North Korea, while its general population suffers quite a bit from deprivation, from lack of material benefits, and so forth, there's a much more highly trained resource cadre of elites who are able to do a lot of things that are fairly sophisticated. So whether it comes to North Korean hacking teams that we know about, or even the sort of development of the nuclear side, there is a sophisticated element that has been able to obtain clandestine help from other countries with strong capabilities, and that has allowed, I think, North Korea to do quite a bit more than one would give them, that one would otherwise speculate they would be able to do.
On the supply side, China has played a significant role in exporting repression-enabling technologies to other autocratic regimes. How has Chinese innovation and incentives affected the global proliferation of these technologies? We hear a lot about China's hold over Africa, but are African client states opting for Chinese repression-enabling AI? And what about other critical Chinese customers in, say, the Middle East and Latin America?
Yeah, I think it's really a two-way street across the board. I mean, I think that's the first thing that's necessary, that it takes a customer that's interested, one that has repressive objectives in mind, in order to actually then sort of see a technology like advanced surveillance and have a conversation with Chinese companies and say, that's something that I would find beneficial. And there's, by no means is it limited to Africa. In fact, if anything, I would look to the Middle East first as probably more attuned to acquiring, some of the advanced biometric and safe city systems, not only because there's more resources available to acquire to get these things, but the kind of level of capacity amongst security services, especially in the Gulf states, is very high. So I think regionally it kind of depends, but if you want to sort of have like a rough guide, I think the more authoritarian your political system is, the more you kind of rely on coercive techniques in which to surveil and monitor your population, the more technology from China and other places might be appealing. Now, I do think that it's worth kind of thinking about how some of this happens, and there is a lot of there's a bit of a demonstration effect that occurs. So you'll get countries that are able to kind of bring in shiny new surveillance systems, oftentimes provided by Chinese manufacturer or integrator, and other countries will see that and they'll say, wait a second, that seems like it's been pretty helpful. Maybe that's something that we want to acquire. And then in conversations with Chinese companies, oftentimes you can get pretty significant discounts due to state subsidies that allow for the for the provision of these supplies, of these tools. And then all of a sudden you have kind of a system that makes its way to places like Kampala, Uganda, Zambia, and other countries. And so, there is kind of a bit of a virtuous effect where the Chinese have it on offer. Sometimes they push, sometimes they don't. When you have a politically repressive environment and a need for these tools, and you see how other countries are using them, these countries will then approach the Chinese, and you'll see this put in place. I mean, I will say it's not just a Chinese phenomenon in terms of their companies. There are many other companies, many of them Western, that are providing different types of surveillance tools as well. So, the Israelis and spyware is a good case in point, where some of the most prominent companies are not Chinese at all, are not Russian, but come from Europe, from the United States, and from Israel. When it comes to tools that penetrate and hack smartphones that allow intelligence agents to collect information on persons of interest.
No, we're just not safe at all. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we're speaking with author and observer on digital repression, Mr. Steven Feldstein. Stephen, it's concerning that these technologies are spreading globally, but what about the dangers they pose in democratic countries? I mean, we've touched on that earlier, but how have we seen these tools being used within democracies? I mean, recently I heard a joke on another local podcast about the tens of thousands of Chinese CCTV operators sitting around monitoring height vision security cameras sold to tens of thousands of Australian homes and businesses. Surely Chinese built and commercially sold security cameras monitoring your garage aren't going to steal classified material or repress your family in your backyard.
Yeah, I think it's all a matter of degree, and I mean, even if you have more resources available to monitor and surveil, not everything is all that important. And I think my concern about Hype Vision stealing data, watching a garage door open or close, twice a day is probably a little lower than other things. And I would say this: so be it. If that's what you want to spend time looking at, that's got to be a waste somewhere in the system. Um, but look, I think one of the areas where there has been sort of a gap in regulation in law, and I'm thinking about the United States, but also Europe as well, has been on when it comes to migration control. There is a host of very advanced technology used, motion detectors, facial biometric scans, data extraction devices that look at different individuals' phones, and there's no rules. There's no real sense of what is constitutionally permitted, what isn't. I mean, there's a sense that if you are a migrant attempting to legally or illegally enter a particular country, as a kind of border security force, it's pretty much fair game to use all sorts of advanced technologies, drones integrated with control towers, integrated with infrared monitoring, and so forth, as a way to control the border. And I don't think there's been enough scrutiny on that end at all. So that's certainly one thing. I think also, when it comes to public security, we've had lots of different protests that have rocked the United States, whether it's social justice protests or other sorts of things. And there's been sort of disproportionate responses from security agencies as a result of that. Again, whether it's drones that are surveilling crowds or social media monitoring tools, many of which rely on machine learning to identify individuals, or services like Clearview AI that uses facial recognition matching techniques to nab certain suspects. There's all sorts of jurisdictions that have different rules associated with what's permissible, what isn't, what's private, what's not. In the meantime, in the sort of face of a kind of a vacuum of guidance, lots of rules or lots of things that would disturb people if they knew what police forces are doing are taking place. And so, the scrutiny needs to apply at home as much as it does abroad. It's not simply an abroad problem. It's not simply, it's the authoritarians doing bad things, and at home we're fine. With the technology, with the capabilities out there, with the temptation to exploit those in ways that really violate core privacy concerns, I think we need to really take a strong look at home and be vigilant about what that means.
Stephen, some argue that public regulators lack the expertise to regulate emerging AI technologies properly. I mean, that goes across the board, whether or not we're talking about autocratic states or democracies. What's your take on this?
I don't buy that. Certainly, there would be a benefit to having more sophisticated, individual with greater engineering, software capacity, and understanding. There's no question about that. And it really depends on kind of what layer and what type of regulation you're looking at. But you can always monitor outcomes, right? You can always ask basic questions about what rights should people have, and to what extent are the use of these technologies violating those rights, and how are those rights being violated? And that doesn't require a computer science degree. That requires maybe a law degree, right? Maybe experience when it comes to understanding the regulatory effect and matched against the impact of different technologies. But I think sometimes we sort of fetishize technologies. We kind of put them up in a sort of special place, and we say, unless you have all these credentials and training and coding and computer science, you don't have you don't have the right. You don't to look at these and make a judgment. And I think it's simply untrue. I think you have a right as an individual living in a society that's democratic to have a voice in there. And I think that the regulator, those in place who are in positions of regulatory authority, ought to take it upon themselves to really scrutinize how these technologies are being used. I think especially what's important is for civil society to be a check on these abuses. And I think to a large degree, we are seeing that shift take place in civil society groups. At home, we look at the ACLU, we look at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, a host of others, Electronic Frontier Foundation, Privacy International, to kind of spotlight abuses, not to mention, of course, media outlets as well, and to cause elected officials and others to take action when they occur. And so I do think there's a shift happening in society where there is a greater interest and a greater desire to do more. And I don't buy the fact that just because you don't have a certain graduate degree that you're not in a position to make those decisions.
It's interesting you say that and it's actually good that you say that. Having worked in the defense industry sector, there is a fetishization of technology generally, but it's very prevalent when you're dealing with defense. Only engineers understand this. If you come from another perspective, you really have only an amateur understanding of everything, because the engineering degree will give you the inside track. And I think that that's actually false. I think that, like with everything else, if it's in the public domain, it is everyone's right to understand where public monies are being spent, or what sort of technology is going to be used on your behalf, whether it be on the battlefield or out in civvy streets. So I absolutely agree with you on that score. So, Stephen, surely autocratic states, predicated as they are on total social and political control, have better ways of managing AI technology in the service of their polities, or are they as blissfully ignorant of many of the current issues as we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think one of the arguments people have made is that with AI tools, it gives authoritarian governments suffer from a weakness, which is that when you don't have elections and you don't have regular polling, you are often unaware of the issues that are really burning people up, the things that really matter to the population. And so that has been kind of this Achilles heel for autocrats who kind of just move along and say, well, we have a nice kind of coercive apparatus in place, everything's fine. Then you have big demonstrations that show a bubbling of discontent, and next thing you know, they're kicked out in the street. There is an argument to be made that with much better social media monitoring, the use of AI tools to have a better sense of what people are saying and thinking, that gives you a leg up in terms of kind of better knowing what's on the minds of the population. And I would say China has been pretty adept at trying to thread the needle, particularly when it comes to preempting issues that could over time end up being challenges politically, but at the moment end up being sort of stovetop kind of kitchen table issues, like things like, well, people are really mad that Chinese regulators are corrupt when it comes to regulating environmental problems as it relates to certain industries, that an industry is polluting an area and people don't think the government's being responsive because they're corrupt and in the pocket of these companies, right? So often what will happen is China will do two things to respond. One, it'll immediately try to quash that dissent so it doesn't spread, so that other people don't get the same idea, and these kind of environmental issues quickly morph into a kind of a social control problem. But two, they will try to take at least symbolic moves to address the issue. And so in a way, it does promote, perversely, good governance, in the sense that, the bubbling up of discontent can actually lead regulators to do something so that they prevent more discontent from happening. But it just so happens that those who bubble up the discontent oftentimes are punished for saying something to begin with. So it's not a very good system in terms of actually addressing your needs, but it can address needs.
Why do you think the US is such a laggard when it comes to regulatory oversight regarding AI? Is unfettered neoliberal capitalism the ultimate driver here, making corporate America willfully blind to AI's social and political dangers, just as big tobacco and big pharma were willfully blind to the harms of tobacco and Oxycontin?
Yeah, I would say two things. I mean, I think certainly there has been, in our sort of more recent history, especially with deregulation, a real bias towards kind of a laissez-faire capitalism that really sort of is biased in favor of a light touch regulatory state and allowing innovation to go ahead, and with the hope that eventually regulation will catch up as needed. And I think there's just a lot of flaws in that model. I mean, the negative externalities from that are profound, and I think rebalancing that type of approach, that type of system, is direly needed. And so that's that kind of extension is playing out, I think, in the technology realm. So that's part of it. But I think the other part is that the U.S. system in particular is by design is meant to be slow. It's meant to be sort of deliberate, right? I mean, even if you look at all the different kind of checks and balances that occur in the U.S., you have a bicameral Congress, so that whatever the House does when it has a speaker, currently doesn't, and the Senate. Maybe something will change by the time we're done with this podcast. Probably not. And you have a Senate that acts in a much slower way. So that's kind of one check. It's a federal system, so you have states, and you also have kind of the federal government kind of acting, and then you have three different branches in addition, between the judicial branch, the legislative, and the executive branch. So you have all these checks and balances, and that's to guard against the kind of tyranny of the majority, to kind of whip through, put in place policies that end up hurting individual rights and minorities. But the flip side of that, it's very hard to bring about consensus, even when there is consensus, and that there's such a strong vote that the minority have. And of course, you want to protect that, but sometimes one could ask, at what cost? At what cost is it undermining the very essence and credibility of the system? And I think we're kind of at that juncture right now on a host of different issues. I think climate change in particular as being a prevalent one, where existentially we're facing such a series of problems when it comes to regulating greenhouse gases, and yet because of a very strong entrenched minority interest, we're unable to take the basic policies necessary to offset the effects of climate change. And I think the same thing can be extrapolated to other industries as well, where taking advantage of a system not designed for efficiency and for quickness, but one designed for multiple checks and balances can oftentimes lead to the detriment of the public.
So is an international treaty governing the use of AI possible under current and projected political conditions?
I don't think so. I don't think we're in a point where a global treaty is one where we can find consensus between countries as sort of diverse in their opinions as China, Russia, the United States, Europe, and many others. Now, there is a few processes underway that are sort of leading to some interesting outcomes. So, for example, the Council of Europe is putting together an AI treaty. The Council of Europe, it doesn't encompass the world by any means. I think it's 50 odd countries or so. But that's something and an effort that could lead to some fruition. I think focusing more on soft law. So instead of the hard law of treaties, but more the soft law and the normative aspect, where there's a kind of broader consensus that's not backed up by enforceability, but that general agreement to kind of do certain things when it comes to protecting rights against AI. I think that's starting to move as well. So there are ways around kind of formal treaties that can still have persuasive effect.
Finally, Stephen, looking into the future, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the course of AI technology in the world?
Well, I want to cheat and say a little bit of both. I think there are a lot of positive things that can happen, ways that we can improve our creativity, free up our thinking, maybe kind of delegate out some of the more mundane tasks of our day to machine learning algorithms, so we can actually do the things that matter in life and not get sort of ground down by rote tasks. On the other hand, there's a lot of downside risks and potential unintended effects that we don't know about. If social media and what happened with Web 2.0 is any guide, as much as it's been nice to be able to communicate with people around the world, to do so in a seamless way, to mobilize ideas, we've also seen how conspiracy theories are rampant, how illiberalism has flourished. And so, we have to guard against both. I mean, ultimately, I think, technology is a reflection of society, of the human experience. And, we're flawed as individuals. We do good things and we also do bad things. And I think, that's one way to sort of think about the effect of technology.
Stephen, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Mr. Stephen Feldstein, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. And to our audience, thanks for tuning in to the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.